How can we paint some ceramic pumpkins with watercolor? Well, let's find out. I'm going to be using something called watercolor ground. It's basically like a liquid watercolor paper, and so you can put it on any surface and it turns it into a surface that is watercolorable. Now, it took a few coats because this ceramic pumpkin that I have is super smooth, and I did try painting with watercolor on it before adding ground, and it really did not work well. So this ground is very important to actually make the watercolor attach. Now, even though watercolor ground is kind of like liquid paper, it still won't act quite the same as actual paper. So it will take some experimentation and learning and practicing, but this is something you can add to blocks of wood. You can even use it to kind of erase or cover up, use it like whiteout on your watercolor paintings. But in this case, it is very handy for turning this smooth ceramic pumpkin into a papery surface that will absorb watercolor paint. Now, you will need to let this dry overnight, preferably 24 hours, to make sure it's ready to be painted on. So once you've lathered it on and layered it, I even did a few coats as well, then let it dry and you can come back the next day and start to create your masterpiece. Here is one I've painted on to test before showing you what it looks like. And one thing, because I did not put my watercolor ground on the bottom of the pumpkin, I did notice a lot of the watery paint did kind of drip down and sit on the table. So make sure you're on a surface that can get kind of stained or messy with your paint. But here I was able to blend and blur some colors together with nice watercolor techniques. So let's go ahead and do that together today. I'm going to speed things up and walk you through what I did so you can see how I use watercolor to make this lovely pumpkin look a little more realistic and have some fun designs. Let's get started with a very watery layer of a medium orange tone. Now, the other pumpkin I started with a light yellow and then progressively got darker to orange, but I thought it'd be fun to have a little variety. So this time I'm starting with orange, but I'm making it very watery, just like you do in a watercolor painting. Now I'm going to paint about half of this pumpkin with my light watery orange, and then while it's still wet, I'm going to add in some of those yellows because, as you know, with watercolor, it blends and bleeds together while wet best. So I'm going to try to take advantage of the drying time and work wet on wet, even on a 3D pumpkin. Now I'm going to do the other side, same thing, starting with a watery, watered down paint, putting it everywhere before I add some yellow as well. Now you might notice the paints I'm using today look a little different than a paint palette you might typically see. These are paper, they're paint on paper by Peerless Paints, family-owned business in Wisconsin that makes super brilliantly bright colors, and they wake up just by adding water to them. So they act just like regular watercolor paints or pan paint. You add water and they wake right up and they're nice and vibrant. Here I'm adding some more reds to the cracks between the bumps on the pumpkin, just to add more variety and value. Same with this brown here. By kind of dripping that in, I want to create these shadows in between the bulges on the pumpkin. It turned out kind of dark at first, so I'm adding some more water to lighten it back up and maybe even mixing some of that yellow and orange in with it. It's a lot about layering and mixing those colors together. Just like on a painting, you want to create variety and change in value. So I'm trying to make those cracks on the pumpkin a little darker while leaving the bumps lighter to make it look 3D. Even though it is already a 3D object and it will have shadow and light, we do want to enhance that illusion by the colors that we pick. Now the stem of the pumpkin obviously should be a nice brown, so I'm mixing or adding some dark brown, trying to use less water to make it darker and putting that on the stem. Now it's getting hard to hold because the whole thing is wet with paint, so I'm trying to carefully paint without grabbing the pumpkin with my hand, but just get ready for some messy hands and surfaces while you're doing this kind of project. It will need to sit on something and you probably will need to turn it around to reach different spots, but that's okay. Part of the fun to get messy. Now on this pumpkin that I already finished, I am going to go back and add a few more layers. Once that first layer is dry, it's nice to add some more contrast and create darker darks and let those lights seem very light. So I'm just going to add a second layer while it's dry, just like you would in a watercolor painting on paper. You start with wet on wet techniques and then you add wet on dry to create that contrast and make more range in your value. Now for this last pumpkin, I'm going to have some fun and do non-traditional pumpkin colors. I'll just speed through it and let you get a look and see some ideas, and then you can decide how you want to create your pumpkin at the end. It was really nice to have a few pumpkins that were ready to create so that I could practice and learn and try new techniques while painting. So I highly recommend preparing a few pumpkins with your watercolor ground, and that way you can really practice and test those techniques because it's still very different than paper, even though you've created a watercolorable surface. So check out how I choose these last colors, and then take your own turn and have fun painting some ceramic pumpkins with watercolor. And we did it. I hope you enjoy turning some ceramic pumpkins into watercolorable surfaces and decorating your home for the season. If you're looking for some more fall-themed projects and painting, make sure to check out the links in the description for some other fun things to try. See you next time.